Your Highness, Your Excellencies, Ministers, Ms. Armstrong, friends of the Global Center for Pluralism. My name's John McNee, and it is my great honor to serve as the Secretary General of the Global Center for Pluralism. And I'm delighted to welcome you all this evening to the 6th Annual Pluralism Lecture, which will be given by the very eminent British historian of religion, Karen Armstrong. Now, this is the first time that we've had this Pluralism Lecture outside of Canada, and we're excited to be in London and to be able to welcome you in the beautiful new Aga Khan Centre. Drawing inspiration from Canada's experience as a multi-ethnic, multicultural society, the Global Centre for Pluralism was founded by His Highness in partnership with the Government of Canada. The Centre is very happy to be joined by the Canadian High Commission as our partner for tonight's event. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the great challenges for all societies in the 21st century, developing countries, emerging powers, and Western societies, will be coming to terms in a productive way with their diversity. Pluralism, or respect for diversity, will be one of the key determinants of national success in this century. The Global Centre for Pluralism, whose headquarters are in Ottawa, is a destination for dialogue, brought to life with events and programming for a global audience. As an applied knowledge organization, it seeks to expand understanding about the sources of inclusion and exclusion in different global regions. A signature initiative of the Centre is the annual Pluralism Lecture, an opportunity for us all to learn from distinguished individuals from around the world who have reflected on the challenges of pluralism in the world. Past lectures have included the late Kofi Annan, Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin of the Canadian Supreme Court, Antonio Guterres, now the UN Secretary General, and Justice Albie Sachs of South Africa. This evening, we are delighted to have Karen Armstrong with us to share her insights on what she calls the urgent global imperative that is pluralism. And following the lecture, Lyse Doucet, the BBC's chief international correspondent and a very distinguished Canadian, will open a conversation with Karen Armstrong, followed by an opportunity for you to ask questions. And so, ladies and gentlemen, it's now with very great pleasure that I invite His Highness the Aga Khan, Chair of the Board of the Global Centre for Pluralism, to introduce our speaker.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Your Excellencies, Ministers, Ms. Armstrong, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Board of the Global Centre for Pluralism to the 2018 Pluralism Lecture at the new Aga Khan Centre here in London. At the outset, I should like to remark on the passing of our fellow director, the late Kofi Annan. I was privileged to know and work with Mr. Annan for many years. He made an enormous contribution to the Global Centre for Pluralism, just one of his many remarkable contributions to humanity. He will be greatly missed. Our thoughts are with Mrs. Annan at this difficult time. It is gratifying that the important work of the Kofi Annan Foundation for a fairer, more peaceful world is continuing. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me a moment to speak of this beautiful building and the transformative power of architecture. I hope you will have the opportunity to explore the building and especially to visit its unique series of gardens, courtyards, and terrace, each one inspired by a different region of the Islamic world. The building also stands as a testament to the value of education. It is a new home for two educational institutions, the Aga Khan University's Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations and the Institute of Ismaili Studies. Through research and learning, they will contribute to increased understanding of the rich history and varied traditions of different Muslim civilizations. In so doing, they should help bridge the gulf of ignorance that has characterized Islamic Western relations for far too long. Tonight's speaker, Karen Armstrong, is a person who has contributed in a remarkable way to illuminating Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, and indeed understanding all of the great religious traditions. One of the world's most respected and prolific historians of religion, Ms. Armstrong has written more than 20 books translated into 45 languages. Notably in fields of blood, religion, and the history of violence, she challenged the view that religion has been the cause of many of history's violent conflicts, and argued convincingly that in many cases, religion has been the pretext. An original thinker and activist, her work has resonated well beyond the realm of theologians and philosophers. A graduate from the University of Oxford with a degree in literature, Ms. Armstrong went on to teach, and in 1982 she had become a freelance writer and broadcaster. After being retained to work on a documentary on St. Paul, she spent time in the Middle East. She was inspired by the time she spent there. She learned and she reflected on the great religions and found her vocation as a writer, exploring the commonalities shared by the faiths of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Commonalities such as the Golden Rule: behave towards others how you would like them to behave towards you. In February 2008, Ms. Armstrong was invited to participate in the TED Speaker Series, where she made the case for the creation of a charter for compassion. Her talk had a great impact and led to her winning the coveted TED Prize, which allowed her to implement the beginnings of the Charter for Compassion. A year and a half later, the final Charter for Compassion was released. The process of its creation included the contributions of more than 150,000 people from around the world who submitted their thoughts online. Their ideas were then refined into a final draft by a panel of leading theologians. This idea of compassion resonates with people. When Amin Hashwani, a business executive and activist in Pakistan, heard Mrs. Armstrong's TED talk, it affected him deeply. In 2011, Amin Hashwani founded the Compassionate School Network, a program to train schools and educators to build student skills in compassion, which is still operating with great success. The momentum and excitement behind this global initiative led to another remarkable book by Mrs. Armstrong, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life. Ladies and gentlemen, looking into the future, I think one of the greatest challenges for the entire world will be finding ways in which we can all achieve a deeper understanding of the other and what makes each of us distinct as human beings and as communities. To achieve this vital goal, reflective, creative, and empathetic thinkers and writers will be critically important. Tonight, we are privileged to hear from one of their most respected voices, Karen Armstrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Highness. What a wonderful building. What a wonderful occasion. Now, why do we need pluralism? Well, just let's take a look at the world. It seems to me that at the moment, what we're seeing is a kind of disease of nationalism, possibly nationalism in its last gasp. The nation state, which is so familiar to us now, is a fairly new creation. It couldn't be achieved until modern communications enabled all members of society to get to know about people far distant from them in their own countries. But very early in the process of the nation state, which helped us all in this country to create industry and mobilize the nation for industry, but very early, a British historian, Lord Acton, made a chilling prediction. He said that the emphasis in the nation state on ethnicity, culture, and language would make it very difficult for people who did not fit the national profile. In some cases, he said, with chilling accuracy, it could mean that they were enslaved or even exterminated. And it was not long after that that the Young Turks, to create a purely Turkic state, massacred over 1 million Armenians. There was later the Nazi Holocaust. And in the closing years of the 20th century, we had the concentration camps again in Bosnia, the result of a lethal mix of Serbian nationalism with a debased form of Serbian Christianity. We're now looking with, I don't want to mention Birmingham, which we've been in the news recently, but a lot of this is due to ego. What the religions all tell us, I've been writing a book about scripture at the moment in all religious traditions, and they all insist that enlightenment insists on overcoming the ego, letting the ego go. Nationalism is about ego. It's about swelling the ego. And often that means excluding the other, as Lord Acton pointed out. But this is becoming worrying. You remember when the Berlin Wall came down, there was dancing in the street. This time, during the last presidential election, people were cheering at the prospect of a wall being built between the United States and Mexico. Now, a lot of it is ego. We're hearing it in our politicians at the moment, people full of themselves. But once this gets mixed up with religion, it is antipathetic. It denies the whole process of religion, which is about Islam, which is about the surrender of the ego. The prostrations of Islam you learn through the body about the profound relinquishment of the ego that is required of the religious life. The early Quraysh were horrified to see the early Muslims groveling on the ground like a slave. But the prostrations teach the body at a level deeper than the rational what is required in this. That instead of the ego that prances and preens and draws attention to itself, you bow your head to the ground. And one of the things we need to understand when we're thinking about religious pluralism and how we deal with other faiths is how little we know. We are, unlike other disciplines, in religion, we're talking about the ineffable, the indescribable. What we call God very often has got narrowed down and become something of an idol. As a child, a Roman Catholic child, 50, 60, 70 years ago, I had to learn this definition of God in the Roman Catholic Catechism. What is God was the question, and quick as a flash we chanted, God is the supreme spirit who alone exists of himself and is infinite in all perfections. Now, I have to say, at 8 years old, that left me cold. But I now think it's entirely incorrect, because it takes for granted that you can simply draw breath and define a word that literally means to set limits upon a reality that must go beyond all our categories and certainties. And in many of the traditions, there was an emphasis to remind us of how little we know, especially about the divine. So to say that you're wrong about God, or we have the better vision of God, this is all ego. This is all a mistake. In India, very early in the 10th century, before the Common Era, they had the Brahmin priests would hold a competition in which the idea was to find a formula for the Brahman, the ultimate reality, which was all that is. It wasn't a clearly defined God in the heavens. It was all that is. And the first priest would kick off using all his knowledge and scholarship to define the Brahman and make a case for that in a single sentence. The others would listen, think, and then respond using all their scholarship to take the vision a little step further. And they would go on and on, one answering the other, each contribution more learned than the last. But the winner was the priest who reduced them all to silence. And in that silence, the Brahman was present. The Brahman was not present in the wordy definitions and declarations of what the ultimate reality was, but was present in the sudden realization of the impotence of speech. And you see, I think with a lot of our strident religious talk today about who is right and who is wrong, we've forgotten this sense of the utterly ineffable. And that when we're talking about God, we literally do not know what we're talking about. Thomas Aquinas, the great 13th century Aristotelian philosopher who tried to rationalize Christianity, is famous for inventing 5 proofs for God's existence, founded on Aristotle. And he's quoting Ibn Sina, whom he calls Avicenna, and in a way that was highly controversial. This was the period of the Crusades, of course, but he is quoting Ibn Sina with great respect. And he gives 5 proofs. They start his masterwork, Summa Theologiae. God is the highest excellence. God is the first mover. God is the prime existent, etc. But no one ever reads the bit that comes next, because having proved God's existence, at the end of each proof, rather perfunctorily, he then says, that is quod omnes dicunt Deum. That is, which can be translated as, that is roughly what we're talking about when we talk about God. But then he pulls the rug out from under our feet. And this is the bit that nobody reads, and says, but we don't know what it is we've proved. All we've proved is the existence of a mystery. We have no idea what a first mover is, or the origin of all things is. Every being that we know has come from something else. It glides, Thomas's entire oeuvre, massive volumes, can be seen as an attempt, a sort of mystical exercise in making you realize that when we're talking about the divine, we don't know what we're talking about. Ibn Sina, Maimonides would have agreed. Allahu Akbar, God is always greater, says the Quran, greater than what we can conceive. I was very attached as a young woman to a 14th century mystical text called The Cloud of Unknowing. And at one point, the author asks the young monk whom he's instructing, he says, well, what do you think God is? And he says, I'm having to tell you, I do not know. I have no idea. Not because we're agnostic or dodging the issue, but because we are talking about something that our minds cannot encompass. This God, whatever the Catholic Catechism said, God is not a being. God is not even the supreme being, which is simply the top of a series of beings. But we're all beings, and our experience of being is always something imperfect. There's a time when we weren't here. There's a time when we won't be here. We fail. We die. We're talking about being itself and an omnipresent reality. This idea of a God stuck in the heavens, sort of arranging the universe, comes from Newton in the 18th century. And then, of course, Newton's theory proved not to work. But the idea had got into people's heads that we could prove God's existence, and it could be scientific. And then you could start blaming the beliefs of others, because we know what God is, and other people just don't. Whereas, in fact, there was a reaction against this with the Romantic poets. And I think of Wordsworth, who said he'd come to look on nature in a different way. He said, I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and in the blue sky, and in the mind of man. A motion and a spirit that informs all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. And that is this omnipresent being that we feel within ourselves, we see in the natural world. You see in the ayat, the signs of God's presence, but which always ultimately eludes us. If once we've started saying that we know what God is and that other people are wrong, we are in fact creating an idol in our own image and likeness. So we need perhaps to rethink some of our terms. Now, the word tolerance is often bandied around when we talk about pluralism, but I really think we need to revisit this word. It comes, as you know, from a Latin root, tolerare, which means to put up with something. It is to endure, to bear something. It's not a wholehearted embrace, it's rather grudging. And it was favoured in the Enlightenment, notably by John Locke, who created the secular state. And in the secular liberal state, he said, in his letter on toleration, the liberal state cannot tolerate either Muslims or Catholics. John Locke was also engaged in the colonization of the United States, and he said that the Native Americans had no right to their land, and if they opposed British occupation, they could be fought and killed. He also said that a master had absolute and despotical rights over a slave, which included the right to kill him at any time. Now, this is empire. This is liberalism, and it is the language of the victor. So perhaps in an age of equality, we should rethink this, revisit it. I was drawn to Islam because of its massive pluralism. The Quran has a pluralistic outlook that you don't find in either of the Jewish or the Christian scriptures. You have those wonderful passages where you go through he lists all the prophets and says we do not distinguish between any of them. But you cannot be a Muslim unless you also accept the prophecy of Jesus, of Abraham, of Moses. A wonderful outlook. God is the light of the world, and you cannot confine the light of the world to a particular lamp because it is ubiquitous. And that wonderful verse where God says, if it had been our will to create you all into a single ummah, we would have done that. But this was not our will. So pluralism is God's will, because the Arabs in the 7th century really had no notion of an exclusive faith. They lived outside the civilized world. They were on the brink of it. They knew nothing about the raging orthodoxies going on in the Byzantine Empire, which I'll return to in a moment. Where they weren't even talking about other religions, but the way other Christians viewed Jesus. But the Quran saw all these faiths as sort of compatible with its own traditions. And the Quran is quite offended by the idea that you must be a Jew or a Christian. No, we go back to Abraham, who lived before the Torah and the Gospel, before the religion of the one God had split into warring camps. So, but then, of course, what happened with Islam came empire. And then, of course, you do have toleration, because in every pre-modern empire, the religion of the ruling class was supreme, and the others were tolerated. And, you think, well, that's a bit of a come down, but believe me, it was a lot better than what was happening at that time in Byzantium, where Christians who did not accept the extremely abstruse theology of the Council of Nicaea were being increasingly marginalized and being forced into baptism. So when the Muslims came into the Middle East, they were greeted with great relief by everybody, by Syrian Christians who said these people make no question about the question of faith. But you have there the beginnings of toleration, as it were. Now it's time, I think, perhaps to move beyond. The other word is compassion. Now, that's not very satisfactory either, even though I've spent a lot of time working on this, because the world has been weakened so much over time. It's often associated with something rather sweet and gentle and nice, or even associated with pity. When I go to feeling sorry for people, again, it's putting you in a superior position where you feel sorry for these poor souls, feel compassion for them. But in fact, compassion, if you look back to the root again, where tolerare meant to put up with something, compassion it comes from a Greek and Latin root meaning to feel with the other, that you are on the same level. And it is summed up in the Golden Rule. Never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself, which means that that as Confucius, the first person to enunciate the Golden Rule in a way that was actually written down in his scriptures, said you use your own feelings as a guide to your treatment with others. So you are on a level. You look into your own heart, discover what gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstance whatsoever to inflict that pain on anybody else. Never treat others. Confucius put it this way: do not impose on others what you yourself do not desire. And he said you do this not just when you feel like it or on an occasion, but, as he said, all day and every day. And that means that every day, all day, every day, you are gradually dethroning the ego from the center of the world, your world, and putting another there. And it is that, Confucius said, that brings you to enlightenment. And all the great traditions, all the great prophets enunciated this rule. Not one of you can be a believer, said the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, unless he desires for his neighbor what he desires for himself. Again, that sense of putting yourself in the shoes of the other. Rabbi Hillel was, in the early 2nd century in Jerusalem, was once asked by a pagan to sum up the whole of Jewish teaching while he stood on one leg. If you can do this, the pagan said, I'll convert to Judaism. And Hillel stood on one leg and said, that which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow human beings. That is the Torah. And everything else is only commentary. Go and study it. So that was one of the things that they insisted, all these writers insisted upon, was that you could not confine this compassion to your own group. You had to reach out to all corners of the world. And the Confucians, again, who were really quite good at this, always envisage the whole process as a series of endlessly expanding concentric circles. You begin with yourself, getting yourself in order, and your family. You can't go preaching peace and love if your own family is miserable and in disarray. But then it doesn't stop there. You then move out to the city in which you live and work hard to make the golden rule operative in your city. But it doesn't stop there. You then move outwards to the whole country to make sure that everything is okay in your immediate country, and finally to the whole world, that it never stops. You reach out to the ends of the earth. And that dynamism, moving outwards to the ends of the earth, is important. Love your enemy, said Jesus. Now, this is another word that's been debased. Love, in the English language. Didn't you love that movie? I love ice cream, or it's something sort of sentimental. No. Jesus is doing a bit of rabbinic midrash on a ruling in the Hebrew Bible, where in Leviticus he says, love your neighbor. And Jesus is saying, no, take that a bit further and love the enemy. The Hebrew word was hesed, which meant loyalty. And it was a political term used in international treaties. Two kings would promise to love one another. And that didn't mean they would fall into one another's arms and become best friends, but they would look out for one another's interests. They would come to their aid even in time of trouble. They would take cognizance of that person's state, even if it went against their short-term interests, and give them financial, military support, whatever they needed. That is the kind of love we have to give to our so-called enemies today if we want a viable world. And one of the people who formulated the Golden Rule were not operating in wonderful, peaceful societies or sort of locked in prayer on lonely mountaintops. They were living in societies like our own, where violence and warfare had reached an unprecedented crescendo. In China, for example, at Confucius's time, they were just about to embark on a terrible period lasting centuries, known as the Warring States period, when the various states of China, with increasingly advanced weaponry, slaughtered one another in terrible wars until only one was left. And that became the empire of China. It was a brutal reunification of China that lasted 200 to 300 years. And the Chinese were afraid that they would actually slaughter one another. But this is the same problem we have today. We're living in a world of hatred and mistrust, and unless we treat our enemies somehow with equanimity, the world will simply not be a viable place. Now, one of the Chinese sages said you have to have yan ai, which means concern for everybody. His name was Mozi. And that's often translated, yan ai is often translated universal love. But that's a bit too romantic for Mozi, who was a brutally pragmatic kind of guy. But he said we must look at one another, another state, as though it were our own. And that if we thought of that state as our own, we wouldn't invade it. We've got to reach out and think of the enemy. And that includes their religion. All the scriptures insist on the absolute sacrality of each human being. That each human being is special and unique. And Ibn Arabi, the great Muslim mystic and philosopher, said that every single human being was an incarnation of one of God's hidden names. And each human being, therefore, was a unique and unrepeatable revelation of God, an aspect of God to the world. And we can deface that within ourselves, but if we do that, the world will be deprived of that particular revelation of the divine. And he said, of course, that the way in which that is expressed will be affected by the faith tradition into which you are born. Jews will have one particular take on it, Christians another, Muslims another, but each was separate. Each was valuable. Each was crucial. He was going back to that pluralism of the Quran, which looks at the sanctity and legitimacy of all other faiths, not seeing them as second-rate, but as partners, because they're about the illimitable, unknowable God. The Hindus said that every single human being, not even every single human being, but every single being has at its core the Atman. That's its inmost, deepest self. And and that's in a tree or an insect or in the human being. And it's difficult to access that. You have but you have to acknowledge it and see that all these beings, each one of them, says one of the sages, we all think ourselves so special and interesting and unique, but we are just like we all have that same core, that same utter sacred core. And we're like a lot of rivers who all end up in the ocean. And once they're in the ocean, he said, they don't go around saying, well, I'm this river or I'm that river. No, they're just the ocean and we are just the divine. But again, that's whatever faith tradition you're in, is in that sense of sacrality. We are losing that sense of sacrality. We are treating people too much as instruments. We've seen in London the terrible business of Grenfell Tower, when 72 people were burned to death in a high-rise block, which had been given inadequate cladding, cheap cladding, the flammable cladding. And children in schools now are needing food in food banks because the level of poverty is so great in London. This is a disgrace, and it should make us uncomfortable. The Buddha said that enlightenment was possible for every single human being, and he came to enlightenment by developing a particular form of yoga. He tried the normal kinds of yoga, but he wasn't impressed by it, because at the end of it, he said, yes, he'd experienced all these exotic states, but he was still his old, unruly, egotistic self. But he achieved enlightenment by a compassionate form of yoga, whereby he sent out thoughts of goodwill to all the different corners of the earth, going further and further away, rather like those concentric circles in China, until you experienced and you felt equanimity, and you sent love and affection to them all, not omitting a single creature, until in the end you had achieved equanimity, which is about, again, the loss of ego, that you're not loving people because they're doing something to you or because they're flattering you, but because they are themselves sacred and worthy of utter respect. And that's what brought him to enlightenment. But he insisted too that this had to be translated into practical action. Secularism has been great for religion. It should be great for religion. Because it has freed religion from the injustice that characterizes every single state. No state has ever achieved total justice. There's always inequity, there's always a degree of oppression, there's always a degree of greed, however much we put our hands on our hearts, and this should make us uncomfortable. But the trouble with secularism is that it's made people wary of acting politically at all. People are saying we don't get on with that, and things have become a little bit of an ego trip. My personal relation with Jesus, for example, and the rest of the world goes awry. The scriptures all, in every tradition, say you have to work for the good of others, all others, not just those in your own camp, practically and creatively. That is the route to enlightenment. The Buddha, after he achieved enlightenment, had the inconvenient thought that perhaps he should preach the message and preach how he'd discovered this wonderful peace in nirvana. And then he thought, no, I don't want to do that. Because people don't want to lose their egos. They like that. And it's going to be too depressing and dispiriting for me. I'm not going to do it. At which point, Brahma, the god in the highest heaven, uttered a terrible cry. And he said, then the world will be utterly lost. And he descended from heaven and knelt before the enlightened man. In India, the gods are lower than the enlightened human being. And he said, Lord, please preach your Dharma, because there are all these people lost and in trouble. The Buddha, it says, looked at the world with an eye of compassion and spent his life, the rest 40 years of his life, tramping round the towns and villages of India. And he did not preach. He was utterly uninterested in a person's theological opinions. He couldn't have cared less whether they believed in gods or whether they didn't believe in gods. What was important was whether they practiced compassion and left themselves behind. And he always adapted his teaching to the people he was talking to. He didn't approve, for example, of the cult of the Atman that I mentioned earlier. But when he was speaking to Brahmins, he used that image in order so that they would find their own way to achieve enlightenment. And he would, one day he came across a crowd of Brahmins who was trying to have visions of Brahma up in the highest heaven. And he said, look, that's okay, though he didn't believe in any gods, but he said, that's fine, but why don't you try to become like Brahma yourself by means of enlightenment, an enlightened and enhanced person? But he took their beliefs and used them to enable they could find their own enlightenment. It's a course that Buddhists later would adopt, and it was called upaya, which was trying to think in terms of the person you're speaking to, not preaching to them in a way that would make them uncomfortable or feel dissatisfied with their faith. Because theology, he said, was irrelevant when you're talking about the ultimate. And so religion is not about beliefs. In fact, our word belief has changed its meaning in the modern period. People are always saying, well, do you believe? The word belief, the English word, came from beleven, which means to love. Accept my believer, which accept my loyalty. It meant when you had believer, you had commitment. You were not believing a whole lot of propositions. It changed its meaning and became the intellectual acceptance of a rather dubious proposition in the 18th century, with people like Newton, who used the word for the first time. He was with the scientists. And he wrote to a friend and said that when he started exploring the cosmos, he had it in mind that what he discovered might work with people considering people for belief in a deity, that they'd see the proofs of God and accept it. But before then, believer meant commitment, and you did religion. It wasn't a business of accepting accepting a certain group of doctrines. And as a child, I was absolutely racked with misery because of all these beliefs that I had to accept. And they were different from other people's beliefs, and therefore you were cast asunder. Jews didn't believe in Jesus, neither did Muslims believe in Jesus, although they said they believed in God. But this is a modern conundrum, and it's caused a lot of problems. Faith meant commitment, fides. Chaucer's knight said, "Accept my believer" to his lady, which means accept my loyalty, accept my fealty, accept my commitment. St. Anselm, who is not a theologian I admire or quote him much, but he did say, made a statement, "I believe in order that I may understand." And I always thought you had to accept all these beliefs of your particular tradition, and then when you'd finally sort of bludgeoned your brain into accepting some of these weird ideas, then you would find enlightenment. But no, credo, the word he's used speaking Latin, the word credo comes from cordare, to give your heart. Credo, cordare. So I commit myself, and then I will understand. You will discover the insights of your faith by living it out. So your beliefs clashing with other people's beliefs, this is all irrelevant. Now, I'm going to end with a quotation from Ibn Arabi again. And I found this quotation at a time when I was still very hostile to faith and wasn't sure that I believed in anything. But this, it chimed with what I'd found in the Quran, and it chimed with what I was learning about all these faiths, about their profound unanimity despite all the noise and the controversy. And I found this helpful, and I hope you find it helpful too. Do not praise your own faith so exclusively that you disbelieve all the rest. If you do this, you will miss much good. Nay, you'll fail to realize the real truth of the matter. God, the omnipresent and omniscient, cannot be confined to any one creed. For he says in the Quran, wheresoever ye turn, there is the face of Allah. Everybody praises what he knows. His God is his own creature. And in praising it, he praises himself. Consequently, he blames the beliefs of others, which he would not do if he were just, but his dislike is based on ignorance. Thank you.
Karen, I think I speak for all of us here tonight in this splendid setting that we've been very much enriched and perhaps in ways reassured by your reading of the scriptures and your reading of the broad sweep of history. So thank you very much for sharing some of just a small bit of your vast knowledge of the great religions of our world. Let me situate a first question in the world in which we live. It's often said in general terms that we live in a world in which countries in the West, largely Judeo-Christian societies, the religion matters less in terms, at least, of the religions of the book. And yet in other parts of the world, the religion matters more, often in terms of Islam or particular interpretations of Islam. Now, it may not be so neat a binary divide, but there are trends, and I'm wondering whether you see danger in these trends.
I think America, religion is very important in America. Not always great religion. You know, they've got their own intolerance, but there's a lot too of really interesting, significant thinking, religious thinking in America. And they mind about it. And I'm told that in some cases, religion in America is the second most religious country in the world after India. Religion's hard to do well. And a lot of them, like it's an art form. I do see religion as an art form. It is about the discovery of meaning, and it expresses itself best in terms of art, in music, poetry, painting, the architecture, as we see here.
And politics in contemporary terms. One would say evangelical Christian in America is becoming more and more political.
Oh, that is true, but with not a very compassionate politics. That's the point. I'm all for people getting political, if it means they're going to work for a more compassionate, equal world. And indeed, our reading of scriptures should compel us to work for that. And that may need politics, that you need justice, and that every single human being should be as seen as sacred. But of course, you can a lot of this right-wing stuff, it's exploited by the government too. But it's not that that religion is making them do this. The religions are telling them to be compassionate, but we reuse it. But religion is very important to.
If you look at Europe, Britain, how they talk about Britain.
Yeah, Britain, I think, is entirely unreligious.
If you say something nice about Britain, we really need to hear.
You know, it's one of the worst markets for my books. But I don't mind that because I get left alone to do my work, so that's fine. But things are very different, you know, when I go to Holland. That's the second biggest market for me after the United States. Now, we always think of the Dutch as being extremely secular, and indeed they are, but they understand religion in the way the British just don't. It's been left, I think, I come from Ireland, you see, originally, my people, so that's very, very different. But the British, I just don't think, get it at all. And I'm not sure that we ever did, really. I think we were always, it's an art form at which we didn't excel. Just as some nations have wonderful painting and music. We haven't had much of this. We have very fine literature in Britain. But religion we didn't do. And even back, we were always, and we're the first to start with the Enlightenment, and Newton is ours, and all this. So that was Britain. But the Dutch, that's the second biggest market for me after in that tiny little country. They outsell the British by 15-1, and they ask really good questions. They understand it. And they are involved. Similarly, I had an extraordinary time in Brussels just a few months ago. And I thought, well, this is going to be a bit grim, but the place was packed. And the people were moved. And so
you think if there's no Brexit, Britain will become more religious?
Oh, no. No. Brexit is their new religion, I think. But just because nationalism is seen as like sport, is a kind of religiosity.
I'm just wondering, since you seem to find such hope and reassurance in religion, and you've seen everything that's gone before, you began by talking about nationalism. And I think everyone here tonight worries about the rise of nationalism, the emphasis on the other. But when you look at the sometimes violent nationalisms of today, with the rise of sometimes violent Islamophobia, when you look at it in the vast sweep of history, does it seem particularly troublesome now?
Violence, you mean?
Just this phase that we're going through. Some people ask, is this a phase or is this the new normal?
I think it's a little bit different because I think we're on the cusp of major change. You see, the nation state is looking increasingly creaky because it's not needed much anymore, and we're becoming more and more global because we are interlinked as the human race as never before on the World Wide Web. Our economies are profoundly interconnected. When stocks fall in one part of the world, stocks plummet all around the world that day. We all face the same environmental catastrophe, and we are retreating from that into these ghettos, a sort of safety thing. And the same is happening in religion. You see, the more we discover about other faiths, because before people who didn't travel much, they might have heard a few weird and wonderful things happening in India, but they had no idea what was going on. But now, since the early 19th century, we've had a chance to see the profundity of these faiths. And the profound unanimity, as well as the fascinating, revealing, and interesting differences. And a lot of people don't like that, again, in the same way, just as it's a sort of Brexit thing. You know, Brexit is a sort of nationalism gone berserk. In the face of an encroaching globalization. And similarly, people retreat into denominational ghettos and become fundamentalists. And it's significant that the first fundamentalist movement occurred in the United States at this juncture when ecumenism was becoming, I mean, we're talking ecumenism simply about talking to other Christians, you know, like Catholics, not Muslims or anything exotic of that sort, but still there was this retreat. And I think we're on a cusp of change where we don't know how we're going to manage our global world, how we're going to manage the failing environment,
and so on. Yes.
And Brexit. This ridiculous remark that people make about.
I'll be doing a great favor to our audience if I concentrate too much on Brexit tonight. People came tonight to get away from Brexit, I think. Yeah. But I have to say that I was a bit troubled when you gave your very learned interpretation that God wasn't up there at a desk in the heavens worrying about things. But it may explain why, as a university student in Canada, he didn't respond to my pleas for help on my essays.
No, he wouldn't.
Let me open the floor to your questions. Maybe you, Your Highness, you'd like to ask something. You who preach tolerance on so many occasions. I think we have microphones as well.
I'm interested in the relationship between pluralism and monotheism. Because many of the societies around the world are facing that issue today.
Yes, I know that.
The relationship between pluralism and monotheism.
You know, one God. It depends, as I was trying to say in my speech, how you see God. You see, if you see God as your in that way of a being, one single being up there, who had all other gods as false. And idols, then yes, you are in a bind, and that's why it's important to stretch to realize that what we call God is not simply a being. Thomas Aquinas and people, the cloud of unknowing, Ibn Sina, Maimonides, they knew that. They knew that we're not talking about a being in the sky, someone out there who only likes this particular people. But of course, you can abuse this and say that God is on my side. That certainly is the case. And yet, you know, I wonder if these people ever read their scriptures. I mean, Jesus, for example, was an anarchic human being. He didn't observe the boundaries. He was continually offending people by going out and crossing barriers, constantly crossing barriers, always having the wrong people to dinner, consorting with women who were seen to be impure, beyond the pale, or women in adultery, to take them like that, reaching across the barriers. And, you know, and I remember an imam in Washington, Imam Majid, invited a whole lot of conservative members of Congress to listen to me once. I said, thanks very much. And one of them said, you know, Miss Armstrong, you know, what do you say about Jesus when he said, you know, no one comes to the Father but through me? And I said, well, now look, just think of this man. Constantly, as I was saying, reaching across boundaries, doing the wrong thing, offending everybody in sight in order to reach out to all. And you have the timidity to say that if he came back now and saw the state of our world, he would say prissily, sorry, no one comes to the Father but through. This is not right. And that's, it's where you need to know a little bit about scriptural history and about how that comes in one gospel, which is a gospel, John's gospel, which is having problems, not with Jews but with other Christians. And they're having a fight. And this is John's Jesus. And, that it's much more complex. And you see, I think the Quran, as I said, has this extraordinarily broad outreach. That state where the Quran says, as I quoted, that if it had been our will for you all to be in one single ummah, we would have done it. But this was not our will. And you have the Sufis, who have, and I know they're not in vogue in some parts of the world, but they have an outstanding appreciation, like Ibn Arabi, of the validity of other faiths. Because once you've glimpsed the divine, then you've left these man-made distinctions behind. But all too often we put fences on God because of our own insecurity. It makes us feel good, and it swells our ego because we're on the right side. I mean, I grew up like this. I mean, I grew up a Catholic, and we didn't even think Protestants were and neither did they think we were. We didn't go to. We lived in a kind of ghetto in Birmingham, a ghetto of Irish. We were all of Irish descent. Went to Catholic schools, could sort of had dances and clubs and church together, and felt that we were a sacred enclave. Well, I no longer think that anymore, as you may have gathered.
Let's take another question. Let's take another question. Yes, Rory Stewart. Yes. Rory Stewart.
Very interested in your personal experience when you first began discussing Islam, and whether you ever felt nervous moving on to that territory, whether you were ever concerned about offending people, and whether you've actually been in debate with Salafis and what happens when you get into those kinds of discussions.
Well, I began by my interest in Islam was with Palestinians in Jerusalem. So they were my friends, and that was fine. I wrote my first biography of the Prophet, as I was telling His Highness earlier, at the time of the Salman Rushdie crisis, because I felt that my own people didn't know anything about the Prophet, and all they knew was what Salman was telling them. And we couldn't find a publisher, because everybody thought that I would be joining Salman in hiding, that the Muslims would be out. But the Muslims, I was amazed by the fact that the Muslims took it to their hearts. And I must say that I've experienced extraordinary generosity. There are times, however, when I went to Malaysia, for example, my books are banned there.
Oh.
And yet the whole thing was so contradictory, because my books are banned, but the government paid my first-class airfare and actually gave me a dinner in my honor. And the people, and of course you can't ban books in this day and age of Amazon and the internet. And the audience were coming up defiantly waving their books under the nose of the officials who, so there was that funny thing. But there were people who said I shouldn't be talking about Islam because I had I was not a Muslim, and but I've rather steered clear. I've not gone to Saudi Arabia, for example. Have
you been invited?
I was once, but it was such a peremptory invitation. It was like, get on a plane on Friday, economy. So I mean, I thought, this does not sound a pleasant invitation.
What about Al-Aqsa in Egypt?
Oh, I've been there.
Al-Aqsa,
I've been there,
yeah.
and in fact, Al-Aqsa invited me back to speak to the students, the dean of Al-Aqsa. And he had my book, and he said, anybody who could write this is a friend of Islam, and I had his photograph taken with me. So that was no problem. Al-Aqsa was no problem. It was interesting, though. They held at Al-Aqsa, I think, the first interfaith conference they'd ever had. And so a whole lot of the suspects, Esposito, people like me, went over there. We were all on the stage together. And there the anger in the hall came out. There we were representing the West, and they were slamming away. But when you got off the platform, they all wanted their photographs taken and for me to sign their books. But we represented the West at that point. And so that was there.
I think we have time for one more question. So the pressurists have a very good question. I see Ed Mortimer there. I could take a gamble that it might be a very good question.
And generally, we didn't talk about tolerance for precisely the reason you said, that it seemed to have this slightly de haut en bas approach. And he generally, in his speeches, talked about mutual respect between people of different views and opinions and faiths. Later, I had another privilege, which was to be the rapporteur for a group of eminent persons from the Council of Europe, chaired by Joschka Fischer, who was the former foreign minister of Germany. And the same point came up, and I said, I think, well, rather than tolerance, we ought to say mutual respect. And he said, do I have to respect bigots? What should I have answered to him?
That is a good question. I think you respect their right to think what they do, as they do, but not accept the way they speak or behave to others. And you have to see where the bigots have come from. I used to be a kind of bigot years ago because I'd been injured by religion. As a young woman, and I was very, very angry about religion and hated it. So, but then that was quite normal in Britain. So for once, I fitted in. But that experience, see where they've come from, and accept, behave to them with courtesy, but do not, when they are, if they attack a mosque or utter blasphemous remarks in order to offend, you don't accept that because it's hurting other people. I think you respect the person because you never know what has caused someone. Each human being is a mystery with a history of pain and discomfort that we'll probably never know. So accept that, but don't accept the deeds that they do. Those you can say quite distinctly that to defame others, to insult others, that is not acceptable. But do not start hating them. That's a form of respect, I think.
Caroline, just one last word for you. From all of what you have drawn, both negative and positive, your most latest project about compassion and the Charter, has that left you with greater hope?
Yes and no. Yes and no. Sometimes it's been quite frustrating because, especially in the United States, we've got sort of nothing is happening in the UK, of course. There's nothing, not a nibble of interest, and my friends' eyes glaze with boredom when I mention it. But in the United States, there's a great enthusiasm for it, and everybody is very, very keen to make. We have got a load of compassionate cities, going. Now, my dream was always to twin some of these cities, so that you have a city in the United States twinned with, say, Amman in the Middle East, say Seattle and Amman, because Seattle is very keen to, Amman was very keen to team up with Seattle, and so that they could exchange news. The people in the schools and universities could exchange emails and form email friendships, and some of the misapprehensions we have about each other could be laid to rest. I cannot get any of them to do it. They just want their little city to be a nice, compassionate city. But you see, what keep on thinking of the concentric circles of the Confucians, that you must spread out from your own city to the whole world. But last week I was in Pakistan. And that is where, I'm now convinced, that is where the hope of the Charter is.
Oh.
Some extraordinary work has been...
Everyone here who knows Pakistan, their eyes just opened wide.
I know.
Given what they're happening with the Ahmadis and the Shia
I know,
Sunni
and that's why, because...
Hashwani, you mentioned about Hashwani.
It's him. I've been working with him, and for some 10 years. And what he's done, these schools, he's got the government working on these schools. There are now over 21,000 people children going through this compassionate education, which was not just evolved by some goody-goodies, but was devised by leading educationalists to introduce compassionate teaching into core subjects of the curriculum. And we started a new endeavour last week as I opened. Amin noticed that, there's massive disparity of wealth. He noticed that these big flyovers, bridges, that underneath there was all this space. So he got the city council to agree to do it up. Oh. They had to get rid of all the rubble and the drug addicts and all that. The street children are living under these bridges. Now the first one was opened last week. I opened it, and it's a state-of-the-art. The students from the university will come and teach kids there who don't go to school.
Oh, very good.
They have put up. The traffic is roaring around overhead, but they've put up soundproofing, and the rooms are all painted beautifully. But they can play cricket in there. They're going to teach the girls soccer, but they're also waiting to see what this community actually needs. There was one rickshaw driver who is going to be crucial to this endeavour, because the Pakistani pedestrians must be the bravest in the world crossing roads. But they want to see. This rickshaw driver made a speech, and he wept openly, and he said, we've had nowhere to go, nowhere to go, and but they're waiting to see what this community needs, not coming in to impose it. And he's got permission to do this with 5 other bridges in the city, but this is. They've also got a program for empowering women, teaching them a skill, but in a compassionate setting. And I went into the Aga Khan Children's Hospital, where they've adopted my 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life for a program to help nurses and doctors get on with one another, and to help the children, because that's always a problem, and to help the children are now improving. The children who've been through nursing in this compassionate way are going home several days earlier. Now, I asked him when I left, I said, would you start linking up with some other cities? Sure, he said. So we've got lots of cities in Indonesia. They've got their problems at the moment, but I'd like to link up with them and with Amman and various others. We've also had an invitation to go into the UAE, the two of us, to work with them on their new
they have a tolerance
and pluralism. Yeah. So they came to me and asked if we would go. So we'll be going in November.
Well, thank you.
So
yes.
I see compassion coming from the Muslim world. that is where the hope of the Charter is. That's where we may have a comeback.
Well, I think I thank you from all of us for ending with a positive story of hope. I think we all need it, and I think all of us are very grateful, not just for the time and the thought you put into tonight's lecture, but for imparting some of the wisdom on your own spiritual journey over so many years, manifested in your writing and in your talks. But I'm going to leave the thanks to someone who is a very distinguished Canadian, an author, a broadcaster, a former Governor General of Canada. She is a member of the board of the Global Centre for Pluralism. She also co-founded a very important institute in Canada called the Institute for Canadian Citizenship. And even more than that, something that matters in Canada, she established the Clarkson Cup for hockey, women's hockey. Ladies and gentlemen, the Right Honourable Adrienne Clarkson.
First of all, I want to thank you personally, Karen, for this wonderful encounter with you. So direct, so personal, so felt. And I'm going to tell my husband, too, that you condemn the Westphalian nation state, which is one of the things that he really believes should be condemned at all times. After having read your books and having seen your trajectory as a person of faith, as a person who wants people to understand each other through the prisms of what we already have and what we know or we think we know. It is deeply, deeply appreciated to see how you syncretize all of this and make it possible for us to understand it. You know, there's a great Canadian author, Margaret Lawrence, who is one of our greatest authors. She died about 20 years ago. She said before she died, what I think is the definition of compassion: if I could leave one thought with you, it would be that you feel in your heart's core the reality of others. And to me, I've never found a definition of compassion that matches that, because it takes away the mushy, pity, gooey stuff, which has nothing to do with how we should feel about child poverty in our very rich cities. In Toronto, for instance, where a number of us live, and is a wonderful city, we have something like 6,000 children living in shelters at night. We cannot afford not to have breakfast programs in our schools because so many children come to school otherwise not able to learn because they haven't had food in the morning. And this is in one of the richest and most developed countries in the world, a highly sophisticated political system, and lots of talk about things that we should be doing. And the work that you do, the way in which you look at what has formed us as a human race, religions, we can call it that, belief systems, but I think what you talked about tonight, that it is really about the nature of Godhead. And the nature of Godhead is that it is pervasive. It is something that we feel instinctively but don't have the words for. And I think what you're doing, which to paraphrase, it has been described by you as ethical alchemy, which is that there is a transformation. Transformation is what we need in order to understand where it is that we must go now. We are fond of saying we're living terrible times, and everybody has always lived in terrible times. I myself feel, because my own life was so transformed by war, by the nature of fascism, and my whole family, and the way in which we lived and was so transformed by that I think, am I going to be bracketed by the beginning of my life by fascism and by the end of my life by fascism? Is that what it means? Is that what 2 generations means, actually? So I worry about this, and others worry with me. But when I hear somebody like you and see how you have moved from not only your own pain and suffering, but also through the development of your intellectual and spiritual capacities to be able to give to us that nature and that feeling of what transformation can be and can do for us. I want to thank you so much, and we will take it away with us.